So what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is talk to you about what I call the empowered learner. So over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll just go through what I think are the incredible opportunities for people to learn, but also I want to talk about the barriers that stop people from learning as effectively as they can and as perhaps they should. So, things have moved on an awful lot since Plato's Academy, and learning was absolutely confined to the privileged few. And I think we're very lucky. We sometimes forget that there's never been a better time to be a learner than right now. And that's very exciting, but it's also very timely because there has never been a greater need to learn. So the two are coming together at just the right time, where we can learn more effectively than we've ever learned before, just as we really need to be more effective at learning. Now, to begin with, let's just go on a little mental field trip. Unfortunately, we can't actually go anywhere, but just a little mental exercise to get your minds thinking. So imagine that you are in a classroom, and imagine that you are learning to be a nurse. And I want you to picture that classroom. Now, this isn't a trick question. I'm imagining that most of you will have come up with a mental image, something similar to this, where you're sitting in a classroom and you're going along with an instructor. Now, at the risk of potentially offending any instructors in the room, let's just pretend that for a moment, you're not interested in what they have to say. So just imagine you're in that classroom, turn around, look over your shoulder, and what do you think you might see as you look out that window behind you? Now, I'm guessing most of you will not have imagined this is what you would see when you look out. And that's because that particular classroom that we're looking at here is actually built in an Amazon fulfillment center. And even though you may have picked up when I said you're learning nursing in this particular classroom, you're in an Amazon fulfillment center, you may be just an hourly paid worker, but they have a program called Career Choice, where they're investing in learners. They're funding, they've set up these classrooms in their fulfillment centers to make it even more accessible than ever for learners to get access to great content, and content that crucially is not related to their role within Amazon. And I think that's a fascinating perspective. If you imagine that your employer is paying for learning and it's directly unrelated to your particular job role. And it's not just Amazon who are doing that. So between Target and Walmart, a couple of examples from the US, you're dealing with more than 1 million workers who are eligible to have their learning experience fully funded and given the time to do it, which of course is a crucial component alongside that access. Now, there's going to be a huge amount of talk in the next few months about the future of work. Events like today, tomorrow are great ways to understand what some of those challenges and opportunities that we are as we go increasingly through more buzzwords of post-pandemic and digital transformations, the will we, won't we on remote working, where will that land, and what the future work-life balance is going to look like. And these are huge challenges, but they're not necessarily new. So if we go back as far as 20 odd years ago, the leading management consultant, Peter Drucker, identified the need for people to take control of their own learning progression. And his point was that there's so much going on and there's so much opportunity that we as individuals have to take control of how we're going to integrate learning into our lives and to what end. So what we want to achieve. Now, plenty of people are going to talk to you today and tomorrow about e-learning, but I'm going to change the rules a little bit. And for now, I want to just move away from the old way of e-learning and say, let's call it empowered learning. So just change what the E stands for, because I think the crucial parts for us to talk about are the awareness. So do learners appreciate this golden age of learning that they live in now and how they can maximize their outcomes? And there are various factors that feed in. There's different facets to your learning journey. So what's your motivation like? Funding. So we opened with that, where Amazon and Walmart and Target and these big employers are putting funding into learners' development. But we also have to talk about what courses. The range of things that you can currently learn is absolutely gigantic. And then there's the flexibility piece. So I know tomorrow we'll spend a lot of time talking about the technology and how that gives us great flexibility in when and how we learn, where we learn. But I think there's also a crucial factor that's often overlooked that's going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk to you today. And that's about the techniques of learning, the cognitive psychology that actually makes the difference between learning and really, really effective learning. And I think that is going to have a lot of changes for any L&D professionals in the audience today. There's a huge amount of change coming towards you from this whole space as all of these different facets of the education journey are moving around at that pace. And how do we bridge that gap? Because for me, there's a huge gap between the awareness of what's possible and how people are actually managing their own learning journeys, how L&D departments are advising their staff on learning journeys. And part of this really is that learning has a bit of a PR problem. It's not necessarily seen as a priority for individuals or for corporates who tend to often have slightly narrow view rather than taking the broader view that I'm proposing, where all learning is good. It doesn't have to be specifically job related. And I think when it comes to the motivation piece, so the reason of why people choose to learn. Now, in most cases, people learn to earn. And that's fine, perfectly valid, with plenty of evidence to back up the efficacy of that. But I think we should also always bear in mind the rest of things. So learning for fun. It's actually scientifically proven that you get a greater release of dopamine in your brain from learning a new skill than you do, no disrespect to Netflix, but from binge watching another episode on Netflix. There's also then the health benefits. So learning is really good for your health. And that, I think, is underestimated as a great benefit. And we won't have time to talk much about it today, but there's a think tank in London that has done some terrific work looking at how learning actually benefits society in that bigger picture, the greater good. They've brilliant look at how if people are learning, it reduces, obviously, the time they have to get involved in antisocial behavior. So learning is a hugely positive thing. And that for me is probably the key takeaway, is learning is good. And we really should celebrate that fact and make sure that we seize those opportunities, that learners today are so empowered. And the sad part really is that they don't always realize it and make the most of it, because it's an underappreciated fact that, you know, if you learn more, you're healthier and happier than the people who don't learn. And in terms of that proof of health, I mean, I can send on links to anyone who doubts this. There's full scientific reports to back all this up, that learning has proven demonstrable benefits on health indicators like blood pressure, like your BMI. It can battle against depression, and it can improve your sleep. So really life-affecting things that you get almost as a side benefit from that people focus on learning to earn, and you get all these other things essentially for free thrown into the mix, which I think is wonderfully empowering for people. So if you need any proof that learning to earn is a thing, you can see the evidence, numerous reports that say the more you learn, the more you earn, the less chance you have of ending up unemployed. So I think that's fairly well known and fairly well accepted. But as we change our career, there were two really good books that I read last year about the changes in our career path. So The Squiggly Career and The 100-Year Life. And they both focused on how we exist is changing, the context that we're in, how we navigate through our careers, no longer linear, and also the fact that those careers are longer. And both of these trends taken together put massive pressure on our abilities to learn and to adapt. And that's why, going back to the start, it's so crucial that we take those opportunities that we have now and maximize them so that we're able to function really well in this changed context. And this brings me then to, if learning is as wonderful as I say it is, why don't people do more of it? And I think to look at it fairly simply, some of the reasons are that people don't value it. They don't appreciate the benefits of learning, or they believe that they're no good at it, or their organizations don't necessarily provide the optimal supports. It's not just about the funding, it's about the time, and it's about that growth of awareness for people as to how they can and how they should learn. So people don't necessarily know what's available. And that's a crucial point to get across today, is how do we bridge this gap? How do we help people understand what's available, how they should go about learning? And how do we close this disconnect between what people are aware of? How do we bring in the science that exists that gives us that insight into how people can learn really effectively, the psychology of it? So not about the pedagogy and the technology that we tend to focus on, but that's the cognitive psychology, without needing to be brain surgeons, just understanding a little bit about how the brain works, how it learns. And that's research that's come through in recent decades that hasn't really translated into classrooms and into teaching practices. And that's what I think gives us that crucial ability that we haven't had before, is by harnessing that, we really can make that huge difference. And I guess if there's one thing to focus on for today from me, it's the importance of learning to learn. So understanding that it's that process, that learning how to learn makes a huge difference to the outcome of any learning journey that we go on. So, I mean, I think that's really just something that I want to focus on, and just break up the monotony of the slides for a minute and talk about that process, how important it is about learning to learn. And that really does make a difference in the learning outcomes that people will see at the end. So we generally approach learning now in a way that isn't optimal. And that's a shame, to miss out on that opportunity that we have. And the simple technique of just appreciating how a learning journey is going to unfold makes all the difference. So thinking about thinking, which more technically known as metacognition, but I decided to leave that buzzword off the slides for today. But that just gives us a huge benefit in how we spend our time learning. If we think about it and reflect on it and treat it like a process, anybody can master that. And that gives you a massive advantage as you embark. So that's the ultimate empowerment for learners, is understanding that process, that skill of learning itself, as distinct from focusing on a particular learning objective or learning outcome or a piece of content. So thinking what's the best way to tackle a learning journey makes a huge difference. And if you do that, that is going to predict success more than any other input into that learning journey. Because there are an awful lot of myths. So I did mention earlier how people believe about learning. And unfortunately, an awful lot of beliefs that pervade around learning are actually proven to be wrong. So people believe they can't learn because they don't have a talent or an innate IQ for something. But that isn't true. By applying the techniques like metacognition, you can get past any gap that you perceive in innate IQ. There's also the easy myth, where people think that learning should be easy. And a lot of online courses in particular are sold on the basis of this is easy. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily true. Learning can be easy to access, but it doesn't have to actually be an easy process. And if you expect and accept that, that can make a huge difference. One of the other myths that I find increasingly comforting is the age myth. So people believe they can't learn as they get older. Well, I'm delighted to report that, but scientifically, that has been proven you can still learn as you get older. So the technical things going on in your brain, the synaptogenesis, that creation of new connections in your brain, that does still happen as you age, which is really very encouraging. And then there's the myth around learning styles. So people tend to believe that they have a particular learning style. And if the material isn't presented in that way, they won't learn. Well, there's no scientific evidence that backs that up. So it helps people if they understand that these are myths, that we can work through them, go past, and actually reach effective learning. We can take those barriers away, empowering people for greater learning. And as I said, the metacognition piece, the studies show like that can give you a 15% advantage in your learning compared to a perception of baseline IQs being important in determining the outcomes. So as an example, when we're talking about thinking, what can that look like? Now, generally, when people start on a learning journey, they think it's going to progress quite linear fashion. So they think as they start and as they put in more effort, they'll make linear progress. And if that turns out to not be the case, they lose heart and they quit their learning. And that's a shame, because if you think about it and if you know what to expect, it's much more likely to be a journey like this. So some kind of up and down, varying setbacks as you go. And if you expect that, if you having thought about your thinking before you begin and you expect this to happen, you can plan for it, you won't be surprised, and you won't end up giving up. But if you look at things like the MOOCs like edX and Coursera, and that, they are reporting completion rates of maybe 3 or 4% of users. And I think a lot of that stems from people, the learning experience isn't what they were expecting. So managing those expectations really is a crucial part of empowering people to learn. And rather than selling them on the easy myth, sell them on the reality of what things are going to be like. Now, the thing is, there's another curve that I think is very, very useful when you're thinking about your learning and trying to manage that learning journey. So it dates back, it'd be very ironic if I forgot when it dates back to. So it dates back to the 1880s, but the forgetting curve was the work of a German psychologist called Hermann Ebbinghaus. And he researched and found that an hour after we think we've learned something, we've forgotten half of it already. Now, again, if you're not aware of that, that can be very disheartening. But if you know that that's normal, if you know that's expected, you can start to mitigate it. So giving people this kind of simple background really does help us shape a more effective learning journey. And it reminds me of another piece of psychological research, slightly more recent, but it still was the 1970s in Stanford, called the marshmallow study, where kids were put in a room, offered one marshmallow, and they were told that if they could sit looking at one marshmallow and wait for 15 minutes, they'd get a second one. And it's that positioning of good learning is a slow experience. You've got to wait for that second marshmallow rather than look for that instant gratification. And that's quite the mind shift from people who go on a course, they run through, watch the videos, click through a quiz, and then they think, oh, I'm finished, I've qualified, I've got my certificate. But if you're tested literally after you've finished the content, you're much more likely, as on Ebbinghaus's curve, you're much more likely to remember. And 2 days later, you'll have forgotten a huge amount. So there were a couple of professors, Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, who've done brilliant work on introducing what they call desirable difficulties. So making the learning process a little bit harder than you might intuitively want. So they brought in techniques like spaced repetition, retrieval practice, and interleaving to make it harder for people to learn. But it reflects that learning curve that we know. and it reinforces how you go about learning. And ultimately, even though it feels like a harder journey, people come out with a better outcome. And for me, that is the definition of an empowered learner. We're giving them the right tools so that they can succeed on a better basis. One of the other things that we have to bear in mind is, well, what does success mean? And I love this piece from, there's a great book by Tom Vanderbilt, Beginners, where he was a middle-aged man and he went on a learning journey, tried to pick up a load of new skills and wrote about his reflections in the book. But one of the things that stood out to me was, he said, look, we need to reassess what we consider success. And if people, we tend to use the word mediocre quite pejoratively, but in fact, it means, if you go etymologically all the way back, it means halfway there, which is actually tremendous progress compared to where you start. So we need, I think, to move away from kind of venerating the concept of mastery. Now, we look at mastermind and we potentially believe that that is our objective. But while I admit it would absolutely be less compelling television, in some cases, if that was just adequate mind, that would be good enough. Because we need to look at where our level of expertise needs to land. So it could be that we want to begin something and we just want a novice level. But typically, we're kind of discouraged from not going all the way, not becoming expert at something. So I think if you know what level you're targeting, that can make a huge difference in how you approach your journey and how you'll feel about that learning. Now, that brings me on to talk about what to learn. And the world needs more rocket scientists. And the reason I picked rocket science is because I signed up last year to do a course at MIT on rocket science. And for me, it's a great example of several things. So one is, just because I have a certificate, I would advise you never, ever get in a rocket I've designed. The certificate says I passed the course, but I would not trust a rocket that I designed. But it also, I think, talks to how empowered people are today, where for free you can access any subject you're interested in. And another crucial takeaway, there is no bad learning. So rocket science is of no benefit to me in my career. It never will be a benefit to me in my career to know about rockets. But the great thing about learning, as we'll see in a moment, is how it's additive. The more you learn, the more you can learn. And that's why it's, again, a crucial takeaway for me, is to emphasize the fact, there is no bad learning. Any learning is a good thing. There's nothing where it's not a benefit to have learned more about a topic. And I think if we take some of the other courses that I've done over the last couple of years, so I've learned about color grading video. And that looks at how, if you shoot a home movie, it looks terrible compared to what you see on TV. And part of that is they apply a process called color grading. I was able to study criminal psychology from the University of New South Wales as I sat at home in Dublin. Did my rocket science. I learned about robotics. I did urban planning at Harvard. There's just so much stuff out there to learn that there's never been a greater choice of things. And as I just mentioned, the fact is that learning is additive. So the more you learn, the more you can learn. And again, going into the kind of brain chemistry behind it, as you create those associations in the brain from learning, you give more building blocks to add more information in. So the more you learn, the more you can learn. And I think then that brings us towards the end of today and what I wanted to talk about in terms of, what does that mean in a corporate setting? How are learning and development professionals supposed to operate where everything isn't about the organizational objectives? There's an awful lot of emphasis on the personal objectives. If an employee comes to L&D and says, I want to learn about rocket science and I want you to pay for it, is that a conversation that you're prepared to have? And hopefully it is, but in a lot of organizations, that is going to be a bit of a mind shift. And I think, the way I think about it for L&D is that plea from Jerry Maguire, help me help you. So I think having a shared understanding of how to empower learners. So learners feel empowered, they feel energized, they feel capable of taking ownership of their learning journey, but also that L&D understand that the big picture, the bigger context, and look at it. And just a reference back to the age myth, one thing I was horrified when I was looking for this image to put in the slides, if the audience, the drawback of a virtual thing where I can't see the audience, but many of you may be too young, unfortunately, to even get the reference to Jerry Maguire, because I was a bit horrified to figure out the film is 25 years old now. So again, comforting about that age myth, that you can still learn as you get older. And I want to just finish up with kind of a summary on what I see as the 6 steps to creating an effective, empowered learner. So making sure that people understand and appreciate the benefits of learning. They can identify those barriers, the myths, the bad intuitions that are preventing us from maximizing our learning experiences. Then it's a question of finding something to try. You can try literally anything. There is no bad choice. Try a course. If you don't like it, try something else. If you don't like that, try again. There are so many opportunities there across any topic you can imagine. Then you need to find the time to try. And that can be a question for L&D, that can be a question for your boss, it can be a factor of your domestic life. But finding the time to put into that learning experience, and then to plan it. So to figure out, how much do you want to learn? Do you want to understand, come away as I did from the rocket science course, really appreciating how little I know about the topic? And then applying those proven techniques. So harnessing the desirable difficulties that I mentioned as ways to make sure that the time you invest is invested well. Because it's hard to find time to learn. It takes commitment, it takes motivation. And I think if you apply that time as effectively as it can be, bringing in those cognitive psychology principles, that can really be the difference between a learner and an empowered, effective learner. So pretty much out of time. What I want to do is just remind people that is the ultimate skill, is learning how to learn, just following that process, implementing those techniques, and that will equip you for the modern world. If you've any interest in following up on anything that I've said, so I do have a book, that's the extent of the sales pitch for today. It's on special this week on Amazon if anyone's interested, but my email address is there. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn if there is anything that you'd like to discuss or follow up on.